In this video, we will look at methods in Java. Methods are commonly used to break a problem down into small manageable pieces. Methods simplify programs. If a specific task is performed in several places in the program, a method can be written once to perform that task and then be executed anytime it is needed. And this is known as code reuse. So we get two types of methods. There's a void method and a value returning method. So a void method is one that simply performs a task and then terminates. For example, your system.out.println. So your println method doesn't return a value, but it just does something. So in this case, this is a void method will be printed to the screen. So a void method is one that simply performs a task and then terminates. Now a value returning method not only performs a task, but also sends a value back to the code that called it. And an example of that would be the parseInt method, where we convert a string to an integer. So this is the method parseInt. It accepts a value, and taking that value, it converts the value and it sends back the value, and we can save that value in the number variable. So this is an example of a value returning method, and this is an example of a void method. So a void method is one that does not return a value. So for now, let's just comment out these lines, and then we can look at some methods. So we're going to do some examples on methods. The first method, or the first type of method that we will look at, is the void method. So with methods, you can see that it is still inside of the class, but it's at the same level as this method called the main method. So the main method is the very first method that will execute in your application. And then from there, we can call other methods. So for this specific method, I'm going to have static keyword there. And remember that public is an access specifier. Public is an access specifier. It tells me where can I access this specific method. So if I'm declaring it as public, it means I can use that method basically inside of my own packages as well as inside of other packages. So we will talk about access specifiers a bit later when we start working with classes and objects. So this is an access specifier public, and then static means that this method belongs to the class methods. It doesn't belong to objects of the class methods. And as soon as we start with classes and objects, we'll get into that also a bit more. So for now, we will make our methods public and static. And then you can name, or first your return type in this case, so we're going to have a void method, and then we can give our method a name. Now let's call this method print average. So for this method now, you can see that we've got the access specifier, we've got the static keyword, and then this is the return type. So if I indicate a void there, it means that this method will not return a value. And then the last part there is the name of your method. And then it's your choice on how many values to accept inside of a specific method. In this case, we can have an average of 2 values. So I can say, let's use an integer value 1, and we will have an integer value 2, which now means that this method called print average will accept 2 values, and those 2 values we will use in order to create our average. So we can have a variable in here, let's say double average, and the average will be value 1 plus value 2 that was passed in, and those values summed, the answer that we get there, will be divided by 2. Just remember to put a 2.0 there so that you don't have integer division. So in this case, the average will be whatever you pass into the method value 1 plus the value 2 that you passed in, and the answer of that will be divided by 2 to give you the average. Now we said this is a void method, which means that we're not going to return anything, so we will just use the system out print line there and print out and say something like average and give the average. So this method basically just works out the average and then prints out the average to the screen. So how do we call this method? By just calling print average. Now print average, you can see it wants now an integer value for the first argument and an integer value for the second one. So you can see there also. Right, so now we're going to pass in, let's say we pass in 20 and we pass in 30. And now after passing in 20 and 30, that is calling the method. So what will the method do then? It's going to take that 20, put it into value 1. It's going to take the 30 and put it into value 2. So now when we work out the average, it will be value 1, which is 20, plus the 30 will give you 50, divided by 2 will give you 15. Sorry, not 15, 25. Right, so let's run this quickly. And you will see it prints out the average as 25. So let's create another method, and this method will now be a value returning method. So I can also declare it as public and static. And now instead of saying void, let us return this average instead of just printing it out on the screen. So which means that if I want an average to be returned, which is a double, the return type will be a double as well. So it's going to be public static double instead of public static void. And now let's call this one get average instead of print average. And we will also do the same thing. Let's pass in value 1 and we'll pass in value 2. And then we want to return the average. So we can do that variable again. Double average equals the same thing as we had there. So it will be value 1 plus value 2. And then we're going to divide that by 2.0. So we work out the average exactly the same way. And you can see that it picks up an error here because it's missing a return statement. Remember, this is a value returning method, so we must return something. So that's where the return statement now comes in. We must return then the average. So now we're going to return the average for the user. The user just gives us, or the programmer just pass in the value 1 and the value 2. And the method will work out the average and return the average for me. So how will we do this method? Obviously, because we return something, we can have a variable here called average, and that average will be getting the value from this method. So I'm going to call get average there. That's the method. I'm going to pass in the value 20 and 30. And then the get average method will run, passing in 20, passing in the 30, and then double average will be worked out as 20 plus 30 again, divided by 2 gives you 25, and that value of 25 will be returned, and that will be saved into average here. So if we want to print it out now, I can just print out there, average again, and I can say plus the average there. So let's just make this two different values. Let's make it 30, 30. So it's not the same as that one. And 30 plus 30 gives me 60, divided by 2 gives you 30 again. Okay, so that will be this average that's printed out. So if we run this again, let's just see if the answer is correct. So you can see there the average of 25.0 and the average of 30. Those are the two methods that we actually executed. Now, you can see there's an average variable that we declared as double average. And here we've got double average as well. So these two variables are not the same. This is not the same average that we're referring to. It is allowed for the same variable to declare it if it's in different methods. However, I cannot declare double average here again in the same method. Then it will give me a problem. It will say that it's already defined inside of the scope of this method, and that's not allowed. But it is allowed for me to declare the variable called average there, and I can also declare the average there as well as there. So this one and this one and this one are different averages that was declared. Okay, so these were methods that we worked with number values. Let's try something when we work with strings. So I'm just going to comment these out here so that we don't have them the whole time. And then we just look at some more methods there. So we're going to create another method here. It's also going to be public and static. And then I'm going to call this method, or this method will be a value returning method. It will be returning a string. And let's call this one full name. And we let this method accept a string name and a string surname. And then we will concatenate the name and the surname. So this could be a useful method, or maybe not. So let's just create a string variable there called name, or let's call it full name. And the full name will be the name that was passed in there, that name, plus, let's put a space in between the two, and then the surname. So now we can use this method then to return back the full name there. So I can say return full name, and now that will return whatever the user typed or whatever we got into this method. So the full name method will return a string, but it accepts a name and a surname. The name will be first, then a space, and then surname, and that new string will be saved into the full name variable. And then we will say return full name, which will return that concatenated string. Right, and this is just a long way to do this, and this is why they give us this this problem there. So we can look at doing it in a shorter way in a few moments. Right, so how do we call this method now? So obviously, because it's returning a string, I must be able to have a variable this side where we will actually get back the full name. So I'm going to call that one also full name equals, how do we call this method now? I'm going to call full name, and then I need to pass in a name and a surname. So let's pass in John and Rambo. Right, so those are the two values that we pass in, the name and the surname, John and Rambo, and then it will be concatenated as John and a space and Rambo, and it will be returned back. Where will it be returned back? Into the full name there. And now we can just print out the full name. So let's just print out full name. Let's see if this one runs. This is now working with strings, and you can see there it prints out John Rambo. So we pass John and Rambo to the full name method. The full name method concatenates the two, return it back, and we print it out. Okay, now let's just look at a shorter way of doing this. It's not necessary for us to actually have this variable declared there. I can actually just say return this whole thing for me and then remove that return statement. This will do exactly the same thing. It's because if I say return, what do I need to return? This part there, which concatenates the two. So if I run this again, it will return in any case the concatenation and place it in full name there. So let's just look at the printout. You can see it's still John Rambo. So that's the shorter way of doing it. It's exactly the same what we did here. Instead of having that whole declaration, we can just say return that whole thing there at that, or this whole line. And that will do exactly the same thing. So let's look at one last method that we can use. Let's try working with booleans a bit. You can see that this one gives us a hint there that we can make the access private here, and private means that I can access this method only inside of this class. But let's say I've got another class here that you can define, and I can actually call this method, and if I want to do that, this method must be public. So it doesn't pick up any other classes that's using this method, and that's why it gives us the hint there that we can actually make this one not public but private. But for now, just keep your methods public unless you only want them in this one class. So we're going to create another method, and I'm going to call this one public static boolean, and we're going to call it isValid. So you can see that I'm going to pass in, or I'm going to return a boolean, and the method name is isValid. And we're going to pass in a number value here, and we will check the number if it's in a specific range. So let's just have this a range between, let's say 1 and 100. Okay, and then if it is in that specific range, we will pass in, or we will send back a true value there. So we pass in a number. If the number is in the range of 1 to 100, we return false. Otherwise, we return true. So we'll have a Boolean variable here, and we're going to have that one as the status. And then we can check with an if statement if the number, the one that was passed in now, if that number is greater than or equal to 1, and at the same time that number is also less than or equal 100. Then we know it's inside of the range. Remember, if we want to check for something inside a range, we use the AND operator. And then we can set the status to true. And then the else part there, if it's not between the two values, we will set the status to false. And then at the end, we can just return the status. So this is another way of how to use a method by using booleans. So in this case, we're sending back a boolean. The method's name is valid, and we're checking for a specific number. So we pass in that number. That number is checked. If it's greater than 1, and at the same time it's also less than 100, we know it's inside or less than or equal 100, which means that it's inside the range of 1 to 100. Then we set the status to true. Else, it's not in the range, so the status will be set to false, and then we return the status. So how can we use this method then? So right at the top, I'm going to remove those two statements again, so that we just work with the Boolean one now. So basically what we can do then is to get a value. So I'm going to declare a value equals, let's say the value is 20. And now I can use an if statement to use this method, because if statements needs a Boolean value in order to be true or false. It's some sort of expression. So I'm going to pass in the isValid method here, because the isValid method returns a Boolean. And I'm going to pass in that value that is now a 20. Right, so basically now the isValid method will accept the value of 20. There's the 20. Then we check, is 20 more than or equal 1? Yes, it's more than 1. Is it less than 100? Yes, it is. So status will be set to true, and at the bottom we return then the true value. That true value will be returned to the if statement. The whole if statement will be true, and then we can print out to the screen the value is in range. What will be the else there? That will be if the value is not in range. So we will say the value is not in range. So let's just run this one quickly. This one should actually tell us now that the value is in range, and you can see the value is in range. So if I put something like a -10 there, -10 is not in between 1 and 100, so it should give me the other else statement, or the else statement that says the value is not in range. And you can see the output. Now also a faster way of doing that method would be to actually return this part. So if I remove everything else there, I can actually just return this whole part there and remove all the return statements and even the declaration of the variable. Because what we're doing now is saying return whatever this whole thing evaluates to. So if the number is greater than or equal 1 and the number is less than or equal 100, it will either give me a true or a false. And that's the exact same value that we will be returning. So that's just a very much shorter one, or a shorter statement to use than having that whole big if statement structure. So let's run it again. Remember the value is at -10, so it should actually return a false, and it should say the value is not in range. If I have a 10 there, for example, which is in the range, it should tell me the value is in range. So that's just working with Booleans. Now the last thing for this video that I want to quickly get to is documentation comments. So you remember the comments that we said we get 3 types of comments. It's a single line comment, there's a multi-line comment, and then there's a documentation comment. So for the documentation comment, you put a / and a star, and then you just click on enter. Sorry. Let's just do that again. It's a / and 2 stars, and you just click on enter. And then it opens up this part for you. So the first part there is where the cursor is at. You need to explain what your method does. So in this case, we will just say this method prints the average of 2 numbers. And then you see that there's an @param tag, which refers to these 2 parameters that you've indicated. So you can see it picks up val1 and val2. So now you can explain that variable. So val1, the first value, and then you can say val2 is the second value. Okay, so that's a documentation comment. And now if you go to the getAverage method, you'll see that this method is a void method, so it doesn't return anything, but this one returns something. So look at this documentation comment quickly. You'll see that it also have the two values, but it's got a return at return tag as well. So the first part there is describing the method. This method calculates the average and return it. So value 1, you can still say that is the first value. So I'm just basically comments here. And that one is the second value. And then for the documentation tag at return, what are you returning? The average of the two values. Okay, so these are our documentation comments. So if there's a return value, if it's a void method, you won't have an at return tag. But if it's a value returning method, you will have the at return tag. And basically, you just need to describe what's happening. The very first part, describe your method. Your at param tags, you can describe what every one of those two values that you accept, what do they do, or what are they for, and then the return tag, what are you returning. So that's how we can use documentation comments with our methods.